On the streets of 15th century Rome, there lived a neglected nobleman fallen on hard times that he carried the noblest blood of Constantinople, yet he worried each day about where his next meal would come from, Andreas Palaiologos, the last legitimate heir to the Byzantine Empire. Tonight, by the soft glow of the flickering fire, let us step into his sad, empty life. Some crowns are forged from gold, while others are nothing but yellowed, crumpled sheets of parchment. The life of Andreas Palaiologos was one long, lonely farewell performance that he grew old in exile, clinging to the fading dream of an empire that had perished long ago, even as poverty closed in around him. Close your eyes, and in this slow, gentle narration, feel the echoes of fate hidden in the cracks of history. If the Byzantine Empire was a great fire, he was but a single spark that escaped the flames. The life of Andreas Palaiologos was a constant collision between the last dignity of royalty and the cruel weight of reality. From the bitter winds of Venice to the stone steps of Rome, he once tried to sell his crown just to buy a chance to return home. May this story of the last imperial heir carry you into a calm, profound, and peaceful dream. When the last Roman emperor, Constantine XI, vanished beneath the broken walls of his city, an entire age died forever, yet for Andreas Palaiologos, the nightmare had only just begun. He woke in a cold, cramped attic in Rome, with no servants at his side, only a tattered parchment scroll that proved who he was. Tonight, by the softly dancing fire, let us enter his real life through this story that needs no strenuous memorizing. He was an exile who wandered the courts of Europe, trying to sell the title of Emperor of Rome. Men raised their glasses to him at banquets, then turned and laughed at his purple robe with frayed cuffs that he was the last loyal subject of a fallen empire, and history's cruelest joke. Now, slow your breath. We begin gently, from the very first morning after the empire collapsed. In Greece, 1460, the wind carried a dry, anxious scent, a sign that the end was near. Andreas Palaiologos' father, Thomas, was fleeing with his entire family along rough, winding mountain roads. As despot of the Morea, Thomas clutched his only bargaining chip for entry into Western Europe, the skull of St. Andrew. Young Andreas sat in a jolting carriage, watching his homeland shrink behind him. He did not know it would be the last time he ever saw his home. He remembered his father's tight, tense jaw, and the quiet prayers of their attendants, prayers filled with fear for the survival of the imperial bloodline. When they stepped onto the soil of the Papal States, he believed he had escaped hell and returned to the world of the living. Pope Pius II welcomed them, but his welcome came with strings attached, built on the political illusion that the Orthodox Church would return to Catholic unity. Andreas watched his father kneel before the Pope. In that moment, the spine of the Palaiologos dynasty seemed to bend. He was educated in the Roman court, learning Latin, learning to behave with the restraint and dignity of a Western noble, but in his veins ran the blood of Constantinople, a pride that could never truly be translated into Latin words. This split in his identity became the foundation of his lifelong tragedy. He naively believed that as long as his title remained, and as long as the Pope supported him, it would only be a matter of time before they returned to the Golden Horn. After his father Thomas died, 12-year-old Andreas Palaiologos officially inherited the title of Emperor of Constantinople. But soon enough, the enthusiasm of the Roman Curia faded like winter sunlight, thin, cold, and quickly gone. The new pope no longer wished to pay a costly allowance to a family of emperors, who ruled over no land at all. Andreas discovered that Vatican officials who had once bowed to him now whispered behind his back about his spending. He wrote in his journal, "The air here is heavy, and every coin that falls carries the shame of charity." To keep up the last traces of imperial dignity, he was forced to sell the few pieces of jewelry he had brought from his homeland. He moved from a grand palace to a remote residence, yet he still hung the double-headed eagle emblem at his door. This almost obsessive pursuit of dignity made him seem both pitiful and ridiculous in Roman aristocratic circles. He tried to improve his situation through marriage, but no great European noble family would marry their daughter to a ghost with nothing but a name. His life fell into a strange cycle, maintaining cold imperial majesty in daytime social gatherings, then calculating his debts by lamplight at night. During those years, he began to frequent libraries, searching ancient legal texts for proof of his lawful rights. He was like a drowning man, clinging tightly to the name Palaiologos, not knowing it was the very thing dragging him deeper underwater. Andreas Palaiologos finally realized that the Pope's generosity was a dried-up well. He had to take action himself. He embarked on a long, humiliating journey across Europe, beginning at the brilliant court of France. Before King Charles VIII, Andreas appeared in a posture of desperate gamble. He wore a custom-made deep purple velvet robe, and by the firelight, he showed the French king the charters of Byzantine imperial authority. He proposed that if France would launch a holy war against the Ottomans, he would transfer all his rights to the Byzantine throne to the French royal family. This was more than a political deal. It was the final cry of a man whose pride had been shattered. Charles VIII showed brief curiosity, even giving him a substantial advance, mostly to irritate the Pope diplomatically. Andreas walked the streets of Paris, feeling for the first time the false security that money could buy. He spent recklessly, rewarding servants, buying expensive horses, acting as if he already sat upon the throne of Constantinople. But when Charles VIII actually gathered his armies to march into Italy, his target was not the distant east at all. Andreas became a forgotten pawn in the French court. The so-called agreements became worthless the moment they were signed. He left France with an empty purse and even deeper humiliation, traveling on to Moscow and Spain. He waited in the Madrid sun for an audience with King Ferdinand, only to grow old and grey in the corner of a hall. Each rejection cut another crack into his crown. Yet through these wounds, Andreas learned a cruel, stubborn resilience. In Rome during the 1490s, Andreas Palaiologos entered middle age, his face gaunt from anxiety. He was no longer the hopeful exiled heir, but an eccentric man haunted by debt and gossip. He walked alone the streets of Rome, accompanied only by one loyal, equally impoverished servant. Then, at his most desperate moment, a faint hope appeared. The Grand Duke of Moscow, Ivan III, had married his sister Sophia. He fantasized that Moscow would become the Third Rome, that his nephew would lead an army to reclaim their homeland. He wrote to Moscow, still speaking in the tone of a Byzantine emperor, demanding aid and recognition. But the replies from Moscow were cold with diplomatic politeness. They adopted the Byzantine title and the double-headed eagle, yet refused to accept their impoverished uncle. Andreas felt a loneliness unlike any before. This betrayal by his own blood stung worse than the mockery of foreigners. On the walls of his home, he drew endless maps of Constantinople, every street, every church glowing brightly in his mind. He sank into religious delusions, believing his suffering was atonement for the sins of the Palaiologos dynasty. Half asleep, he often heard the bells of the Golden Horn, and saw the empire he had never known turn to ruins in the sunset. In reality, he was forced to sell his last shred of dignity to local bankers just to pay next week's rent, the imperial seal itself. In 1502, spring arrived late in Rome. The life of Andreas Palaiologos was also reaching its end. He fell ill in a damp, commoner's house, with no royal physicians, only the bitter smell of medicinal herbs. One of his last acts was to confirm his will once more. He bequeathed all his imperial rights to the King of Spain. It was almost his final act of revenge against the world, or perhaps one last mockery of his own life. He died with no imperial ceremony, only a faded purple cloak draped over him. When word reached the Vatican, officials simply checked his name off a list, meaning the long-overdue allowance could finally stop. He was buried in the Pantheon or some unmarked corner of a Roman church, with no fine sarcophagus, no eulogies. The bloodline of Byzantium, which had ruled for nearly 1,000 years, quietly died out in foreign soil. After Andreas Palaiologos' death, the titles he had once taken such pride in passed through a few European monarchs' documents before vanishing entirely. People soon forgot the impoverished man who called himself emperor at banquets. Yet in certain alleys of Naples and Rome, rumors still linger of the Purple Caesar. He was the last man to guard an empty fantasy. His defeat was, in itself, a tragedy of unyielding devotion. The story of Andreas Palaiologos finally faded into Rome's dusty streets. He never saw the sunset over Constantinople, yet he spent his whole life waiting for its afterglow. Tonight, we have walked his impoverished, proud journey, and seen a soul cursed by his own identity. The truth may long be buried beneath the ruins of history, yet his obsession with the dream of restoration still echoes through time. As you listen now, can you find within the sorrow of this last royal line a quiet peace and calm for the late hour? The softly flickering fire has burned down. This old story, which needs no effort to remember, will slip into your dreams beneath the moonlight. May you dream of a golden land without war, without exile, of a young man in a purple robe, worrying no longer about his next meal. Good night. May you have a peaceful, deep, and sweet sleep.